Hola, amigas, and welcome to the Gold Hoops and God podcast. I'm Dr. Guerra, your host. This podcast is designed for Millennial Latinas and is fueled by faith and culture. Ignite the fire within. Welcome back, mujeres. So today is episode 3 of the Gold Hoops and God podcast. Welcome, welcome. If you're tuning in for the first time, thank you for joining this community. If you have been rocking with me since episode 1, I appreciate you and I'm really grateful for your support. In last week's episode, I talked about boundaries and walked us through 6 different kinds of boundaries. So most of the boundaries that I spoke of are actually practiced in relation to other people. However, today I want to talk about a different kind of boundary, or in other words, I want us to consider the ways in which we go back on our own word or we kind of betray ourselves. And this can come in many different forms, including self-sabotage or self-doubt, or just simply allowing the haters to dictate how we feel or what we do. So I invite you to sit back and relax, pour yourself a cup of tea or coffee, whichever you prefer. I'm more of a coffee girl myself. And let me tell you a little story. So let me take you back in time to my undergrad days at Loyola Marymount University. I really had a wonderful college experience, and I am super grateful for the different opportunities that I had, especially in terms of learning about my faith. So LMU is a Catholic university, and it's run by the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits are really big on education, so you may have seen Jesuit colleges or universities or even Jesuit high schools in your area. And LMU specifically is also run by the Marymount Sisters. So all in all, I had a really wonderful experience. Shout out to the class of 2004. I can't believe it's been 20 years since I graduated. So one day, your girl was walking on campus, minding her own business, and I was heading over to 12 noon mass. If you're familiar with the campus, I was walking across the quad and Sunken Gardens, as it's called, towards the church. So I was walking towards Sacred Heart Chapel. And suddenly I ran into 3 of my friends. And they said, "Hey, girl, where are you headed?" And I said, "Oh, I'm heading to mass." And then one of my friends says, "Oh, well, we're going to go get pancakes at IHOP. You want to come?" And I thought to myself, "Oh, man, that sounds kind of good." So, and then another friend chimes in and says, "Besides, you go to church all the time." They're not wrong. Now, they were not wrong. So at the time, I was super involved, and I was a lector, I was a sacristan. If you're not familiar, a sacristan is a person who kind of sets up and prepares the space for the chapels or churches before mass happens. So I was doing that. I was really involved in retreat leading and Christian life community, prayer groups, all kinds of things. So more than likely, I'd gone to mass already that week. But the point is, my friend Sandra, she says, "So what's it going to be? Pancakes or salvation?" Ladies, that day I could not resist. That day I could not resist. I fell into a delicious, sweet, syrup-infused temptation of a stack of buttermilk pancakes. It was my very own Garden of Eden moment. And just like Adam, I ended up at the IHOP on Sepulveda and Manchester Boulevard with my friends. And it was the bomb. If you know, you know. I want to take this idea or this concept of pancakes or salvation and run with it. I was cracking up because it was so perfect. It was such a great reflection of how we feel conflicted sometimes. We feel tempted sometimes in life. So I'm going to run with this idea in this episode. It honestly felt a bit like an analogy for life and for life's choices. And dear listener, you may be listening to me tell this story and thinking, geez, it's not that serious. It's not that deep. You went to brunch with your friends, But it was deep. But it was deep. For me, it was deep. It was like a really poignant moment in my life. And the more I thought about it, I was like, whoa, pancakes or salvation? Which would I really choose if the stakes were high? And I won't get into it on this episode, but even thinking about nutrition, I would say 90% of the people that I know desire, I'll frame it that way, desire to lose weight, but for a whole slew of reasons, it's not happening, right? And we can also get into diet culture and, all the things that go along with it and body image, et cetera, et cetera. I'll probably save that for another episode, but it's interesting. It was interesting for me to think about as well. Okay. So let me deconstruct this idea a little further. And in this episode, I'm going to talk more about my journey in being Catholic. As I sip some coffee, pardon. And boy, it has been a journey. So I was raised Catholic, and it's definitely had its ups and downs. There has been so many different experiences, both positive and negative. But I, like many of you, my amigas, was raised in a Catholic household, Catholic Latinx home. And honestly, it was probably because my parents did not force religion on me and they did not force me to attend church that I actually ended up being very interested in going. I was able to explore my faith without feeling pressured. And I really appreciate that looking back because I hear horror stories of families where kids are basically, and sometimes literally like dragged out of bed. We got to go to church. Church is at 9 a.m., 8 a.m. on a Sunday. The kids are exhausted, but they still get dragged to church. And then, the pastor is talking about all kinds of things that are perhaps negative in terms of being very patriarchal or what have you. So I'm grateful that my parents didn't force me in that way. So over the years, I have noticed some different patterns. And this comes from obviously like studying theology, talking with my students, hearing them out, different reflections, that it seems as though most people who tend to be anti church or anti religion or anti Christian, however you want to take it, it's usually because they had a negative experience as a kid. And it also may be because they see hypocrisy, right? So seeing so-called Christians acting in the most cruel and evil manner. And I know there's a whole slew of reasons why people are not really into church, they're not really into religion, and that's completely fine. That's completely valid. And I would be remiss not to mention, this is Pride Month. I completely understand how for LGBTQ people, religion is a very sensitive subject because, unfortunately, the rampant homophobia is so real. And I know too many people, Latinx people, that have felt a sense of rejection, sometimes from their family, sometimes from their church community, or both, right? And so there's a lot there. And I completely respect that. I understand why people make their choices in terms of whether or not they belong to a church or not religious. So, and always please take my conversations with a grain of salt. In terms of my own journey, I definitely have my own critiques of Christianity. I understand that it's not perfect. I understand there's a lot of issues and flaws with the church, but I want to clarify something. When we say church, oftentimes what people are talking about is the institution. And in Roman Catholicism, it is very deeply rooted in tradition and deeply institutional. So we think automatically the Vatican. Pretty much when we think about the church as an institution, we're thinking about the Vatican in Rome. Shout out to Pope Francis. So one of the things that I thought was so brilliant that someone shared with me, actually it was Orlando Espin. He's an amazing Latinx theologian who has been a wonderful mentor to me, I remember him sharing in a workshop, he said, you know, faith is really a reflection of the people. Faith is the people. The church is the people. It's not tied to an institution. And I'll give you an example. So in El Salvador, Archbishop Oscar Romero, he was beloved. He was revered by the people of El Salvador for a very, very, very long time. And it took decades for the Vatican specifically to honor him and to recognize him as a saint. So, in other words, that's just an example of how the people saw it, right? The people recognized his holiness. The people understood how special and important he was in the story of El Salvador and for the people of El Salvador and for really for Latin Americans in general. And so I always kept that piece of wisdom from Orlando Speen very close to my heart, that it's not about the institution only, right? With all due respect to the institution, but it's really about the people. And so I refuse to let the institution get in the way of me exploring my faith. And so I have recommended to my students whenever they kind of share with me, like, yeah, I would like to go to church, but I don't like my parents' church, or, it would be really cool to kind of reconnect and things. I said, go explore. Explore. Like, not every church community is the same. Not every church is the same. There are actually some welcoming and affirming churches going back to the LGBTQ community. They exist. Queer Latinx people of faith exist. They are in the world, and so if that is something that you are looking for or longing for, please go for it. Don't let anything stop you, or don't let past negative experiences stop you. Another interesting thing that I've noticed is that oftentimes people assume that being a person of faith makes you very boring, very preachy, and judgmental, like a whole slew of negative things, right? If someone kind of identifies as Christian or Catholic or religious, of any background, any religion, be it Muslim, Jewish, etc., Buddhist, etc., there's kind of a negative connotation to that. I can, speak for myself. If you've ever met me in real life, you know that I am the opposite of boring. I am perhaps one of the funnest and the craziest, silliest, perhaps, people that you'll ever meet. Not every believer fits these little boxes that we've created. And another thing that I wanted to share is that I believe that you could absolutely have a strong connection to God, or if you prefer the language of universe, to the divine, however you enjoy kind of thinking about these things, these powers greater than ourselves. There's a way to do it without being preachy. From a Catholic perspective, there's a great quote. It's often attributed to St. Francis of Assisi. It goes like this. It says, "Preach the gospel at all times. Use words if necessary." I love that. I love that. And I think it's true. I think whatever your belief system is, your life should be a testament to your beliefs. Your daily life should reflect your belief system. And I'll say that again. Your daily life should reflect your belief system. And that's not to say that people don't make mistakes. I understand that life is full of its obstacles and struggles, and we're human, and humans make mistakes. And that's totally understandable. Making mistakes is part of how we learn. It's part of being human. And so having some grace for yourself as well, I think, is important. I'm always kind of surprised how many people of faith that I've talked to, in particular younger students. So I work with college students. I'm a professor at a university, and my undergrads, they will often say that they're almost ashamed of being religious, or they kind of hide their faith, again, because we live in a society that has split into two. Now, let me describe these two groups. We live in a society that is sort of bifurcated into two groups. So we have the hyper religious, conservative, also known as the religious right, or or the liberal, progressive, and alas, by default, usually anti-religion side. Okay. And of course, you can put two and two together. This often falls in line with the two party system that we have in the US. So I'm honestly not a fan of either box. I think both are very limiting because there's no nuance. This is really kind of forcing people into two categories that is not really reflective of the complexity of life or the complexity of lived experience. But it's always refreshing to connect with people who don't fit in a box either. You know, the people, as they say, who march to the beat of their own drum. And they exist. We exist. In Catholicism, the people who I love the most and who have really inspired me are the people who embrace their imperfection. So let me explain. There's a wonderful song, it's by Bob Carlisle, called We Fall Down. And the song was played by a retreat leader during a retreat many years ago. And this song has always struck me because of the lyrics. So the refrain goes, and the saints are just the sinners who fall down and get up. I'll say that again. And the saints are just the sinners who fall down and get up. That was such a revelation for me because for the longest time, I really believed that I had to be perfect to be loved by God, that any mistakes that I had made sort of made me unacceptable to God in some way. And again, that's why I'm so grateful to the people in my journey, you know, especially the Catholic people who were very uh, understanding and really listened to me. You know, I'm thinking about like the prayer groups and retreats and things like that, where we really shared kind of what our experiences were. And so I'm grateful for that. So finally realizing that the Creator loves and embraces us exactly as we are. The universe loves us. The Creator embraces us exactly as we are, imperfections and all. And so, in terms of, you know, the saints, we often think of the saints as like perfect people, and they were not. Let me tell you. Let me tell you. So, for example, like Saint Ignatius of Loyola, patron saint of the Jesuit universities, he went through his own transformation. He was originally a military officer from Spain. And when he got injured, he was bedridden for a long time. And one of his family members, I think it was the sister, gave him some reading materials. If I'm remembering correctly, I think it was the Lives of the Saints or something like that. And it was a transformative moment for him, right? And so he had this transformation to where he started to focus on God more. St. Augustine is known as a really important theologian, perhaps one of the most important theologians in Christian theology. And to be honest, he was a bit of a, you know, in modern terms, we'd consider him a bit of a player. He had a very interesting beginning, shall we say. It took him, you know, some time to sort of figure things out, to figure out what he believed. And he finally landed, you know, in Catholicism. If I'm remembering correctly, his mother, Monica, was the one who, you know, had always encouraged him to explore his Catholic identity. And he finally did. And that was where his transformation happened. Anyway, so I share this to say that even the saints who are recognized as saints officially, they're imperfect. They have flaws. They have big flaws. You know, they made mistakes, absolutely. And even still, they were able to get up and keep moving and keep pursuing that relationship with God. And so, as we kind of wrap up a little bit here, I also wanted to talk about this concept of salvation. So, the beginning is kind of this play on words, right? Pancakes or salvation. So, we often think of the word salvation and we immediately think of these gory images. They're very intense, heaven and hell, who's in and who's out. I actually want us to think about salvation for a minute in a more earthy 3D way. What does salvation or liberation mean today? Salvation from what? Salvation from who? If anything, instead of thinking about the fiery brimstone and the little devil man with a pitchfork, I encourage us to think about things a little differently. In terms of liberation, I hope that we can find a sense of liberation from doubt, from cruelty, from negativity. On a more structural level, freedom from racism, from classism, sexism, imperialism, coloniality. Shall I keep going? So there's so many things in this realm, in this world, that we could free ourselves from. In many ways, I feel that we as human beings, we create our own problems. We have created for ourselves, in some ways, hell on earth because we have allowed these cruel systems to take over, which also means on the positive side that we have the power to fix it. We do have the power to fix it, or at least make improvements. We have the power to eliminate poverty. We have the power to end, racism and sexism and all of these things. Shout out to Mexico that just elected their first female president. Amazing. I'm super excited. So, going back to what I was saying, if you take a step back and you really reflect, it is beautiful in the sense that God really does provide everything we need. It's all here for us. The land, the animals, the flowers, the trees, the people, water. I mean, everything is right here for us. And there's actually a dicho in Spanish that I love. It goes like this. It says, Dios aprieta, pero no ahorca, which means God pressures the pressure, but does not strangle you. So, yes, I can attest to this. You will be pushed to the brink in life. Things will feel overwhelming. Absolutely. But there's another quote that kind of goes along with it. God won't give you anything you can't handle. It's deep. It's deep. And not only in my own life, but I hear stories. I hear stories from friends, from family, or even, people share on social media the insane obstacles that people overcome, the crazy, unbelievable things that people survive, physically surviving, let's say car crashes or health scares or those kind of things, or just surviving all kinds of difficulties, like domestic violence, etc. Right? The different things that people survive. It's incredible. And it just, for me, it just speaks to the human spirit. It speaks to resilience, and it's inspiring. It's inspiring. It really is. So sometimes when I reflect on my own life, I even think, how the hell did I get through that? Once it's all kind of, we shall say, like, the storm has passed, I look back and think, damn, how did I get through that? And sitting with my family, we'll talk and be like, man, that was rough. How did we do it? But we did. Again, I would say by the grace of God. I would never say that I got through those things completely alone, because I know deep in my soul that I got through those hardest times with God's help, with the help of the saints, with the help of spirit guides, with the help of ancestors, all of them, at different times. I'm certain of that. I'm certain that they were there for me. There were times in which I was physically alone. So there was no family members or friends to protect me. And I was in serious, vulnerable moments. And I fully believe it was by the grace of God that I got out of those situations. That was a lot. That was a lot, folks. And I hope that this reflection has been helpful for you. I hope that there's been perhaps some pearls of wisdom. If anything, I hope it gives you food for thought. And I will say this, if this episode was a little uncomfortable, or challenging for you, I really invite you to sit with that discomfort for a moment. Let it marinate. Let that marinade sit for a little bit and see what it sparks in you. Sometimes that initial discomfort is actually a sign that that is something that we could explore further, or it's a sign of something that's not healed. So I encourage you to, again, take it with a grain of salt. But if there's something there for you, explore it. Why not? So now it's time, as you know, if you've been listening to my podcast for the last couple of episodes, it's time for your soul work. If you're new here, I always like to give my amigas a little homework. So this week, I'd like you to reflect on your pancakes or salvation moments. Have there been times in which something distracted you or pulled you away or pulled your focus? In terms of faith, have there been things that have pulled you away from God? Or, in other words, things that may have pulled you away from your true self? You can think about it that way too. Are there things that have happened that have pulled you away from your true self? And what are some ways in which you can kind of move closer to that true self? Thanks for tuning in, amigas. On next week's episode entitled Botanicas, Limpias, and Evil Eye, oh my, join me as I talk about other aspects of the spiritual life of Latinas, including visiting botanicas, performing limpias, and warding off that mal de ojo. Thanks again for tuning in to the Gold Hoops and God podcast with Dr. Guerra. New episodes available each Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Ciao for now.